Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. We are back for another episode on the gift that keeps on giving, Chaim Kanievsky's Seforim, and this is part 3 of the Chumash Seforim. I say that jokingly, but the amount of feedback we get from people is tremendous. Just got another message yesterday from a listener, how much he enjoys the content. Can't wait till they come out next. And again, we thank our anonymous sponsor who's sponsored all the Reb Chaim Kanievsky episodes. In memory of Reb Moshe Chaim ben Yitzchak David, may his neshama have an aliyah. Today we're going to be discussing names. It's under the Chumash Seforim category or subject, and I'm sure Rabbi Brett will explain how and why. But we all know, we've all heard stories about people who have gone into Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and he says, that name? No, change it. Whether it's a Tanakh-related issue or something deeper than that. But Reb Chaim Kanievsky was known for having opinions about what names are appropriate, what names are not appropriate, and Rabbi Brut will enlighten us about some of that. So without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut.
Okay, so basically, in the past 2 episodes, we've been talking about Reb Chaim Kanievsky's 2 wonderful Seforim on Chumash, Time the Kral and Mechseyatik. And in the course of especially in the last episode, I mentioned something which is pretty much I was paying back a chayiv of mine throughout the episodes that I keep on mentioning. Reb Chaim Kanievsky has this vast knowledge of midrashim, of unique midrashim. So I mapped out showing how he used this vast knowledge in these Seforim a lot also. I also traced different interesting midrashim that Reb Chaim Kanievsky seems to have had and who published some of them. And today we're going to recap and go a little bit into that as introduction for a few minutes. And the importance of this will be very obvious shortly. To understand greater what Reb Chaim Kanievsky used this data in his works in Chumash and elsewhere is for the sugya of names. Okay. So one of the unique Seforim, you say, now besides the standard midrashim, and for Chaim Kanievsky, standard meant a lot more than most people even know are aware of. We spoke about, for example, the Sefer HaYashar. Mysteriously appears on the scene in the early printing press time, in the early 1500s or somewhere. And mysteriously, until today, a lot has been discussed about it. And the basic question that I discussed last time was, could you rely on it? So I mentioned that Lamaisa, at the end of the day, a lot of people use it. Great giants, just to throw out there, Radal uses it, and Rabbi Yissachar Stern. Rabbi Yissachar Stern, for example, I mentioned then, he has a list where he shows that a lot of he collects showing different parallels or other different types of things. So he does not take a stance against it. That's the key point. So they published Reb Chaim Kanievsky's notes on this chibur a bunch of years ago. Okay. So at the time I mentioned Avraham ben HaGra. So I already spoke out numerous times. I'm very fond of Avraham ben HaGra, and I am working on putting out various writings of his that were never published and some that were published, all about him. So one of his works that we spoke about was Rav Palim, which he collects tons of quotations from Rishonim and Achronim of Midrashim that today we don't have. So what does he say about the Sefer HaYashar? So for example, on page 67 in the Standard Edition, he says it's early. He says but he wants to say that it might even be written from the times, it might go back from the Dar HaMidbar. He brings all different types of other quotes about it, and he definitely is very familiar with the work, and throughout his work he brings the Sefer HaYashar also. Now he was a tremendous expert in Midrashim, as evident from this work, Rav Palim, and he doesn't question it so much, but again, later on, it seems, especially in recent years, more people do question it. I'll just throw out there, Rabbi Ari Kaplan, for example, in his Living Torah, Kasher also brings the Sefer HaYashar as a source. There's a Yaki work, Tuas Yosef. So he also brings the Sefer HaYashar. It's a work about Eretz Yisrael a lot. And eventually he goes, I might have quoted this last time, he goes to check, he says, I'm going to check, I quote it so much, and I'm going to check into to see if it's authentic, and he comes to the conclusion it's authentic. Now, what's the point, not only the Sefer HaYashar, what's the point over here is, so in the Haskamah of Reb Shlomo Kayin, because the Rav Poem was not printed in the lifetime of Avraham ben HaGra, it was published much later. So Reb Shlomo Kayin gives a beautiful Haskamah, and he says these pieces of Chazals are unbelievably helpful to help understand all different types of things. In the introduction to the actual work, Rabbi Avraham ben HaGra says this. Why is he collecting all these pieces? What's the importance of knowing all these midrashim? So he himself sort of throws out there, one of the reasons is it helps understand certain passages in the Gemara that we don't have the whole story, and all of a sudden you have another medrash that adds another clue to the story, or another part of the story, so to speak. And other times he says it helps us with dinim. So these two things, when you start looking through carefully with Reb Chaim Kanievsky's work on Time Dekra, Lemachsei, you'll see his usage of the Midrashim Bechlal, but Sefer HaYashar, for example, again and again, he uses. Now, the concept of using all these types of midrashim, not necessarily Sefer HaYashar, but we could trace it to Gra, was also seemed to be involved with it. Rabbi Avraham ben HaGra brings some discussions he had with his father. One we discussed in the past about Sheva Masechtas, what they were. He had a discussion with his father about the Sefer Raziel. But the bottom line is, the point I'm trying to make is that these midrashim served a purpose, and why they Bechlal were even using them was because it helps for dinim, and B, for piecing together stories. Rabbi Avraham ben HaGra, he wrote Ha'aris on the side of his Gemara, and in recent years, the Yeshurim published it in volume 4 or 5, something like that. And you could see there also how he uses all these types of midrashim and makayos from Rishonim to explain different things in the Gemara. Okay. So, in momentarily, this is the introduction. This is sort of a recap to tighten what we concluded with in the last episode. Now, Lamashal is a Ramban al Torah, Parshas Vayishlach. Just to give one very brief example, so the Ramban in Parshas Vayishlach, he talks about Menachem b'nei Yaakov, and if you look in your handy Ramban that you have near you, you'll see. We know when you learn Parshas Vayishlach, there was a whole story, the whole famous Ma'isa with Dinah, and what Shimon and Levi end up doing, and Yaakov's reaction about it. But if you look in Midrashim, and most notably, it's called Milchemes B'nei Yaakov. There's an extensive medrash with Arichos Nifla about a massive battle that takes place over here. A few pages of it. And says the Ramban, V'im namin b'sefer Milchemes B'nei Yaakov. If you believe the story that's there, and then he mentions briefly what it says over there, and now all this could be found in our Sefer HaYashar. So this goes back with what I was saying last time also, that the Sefer HaYashar gives a lot of the backstory to Sefer Bereshis especially. I also mentioned that kids could use it to impress their Rabbeim, or to stump their Rabbeim with all different data that they could pull out from the Sefer HaYashar, assuming it's true. Now, why? And one last Maramakam, and then we'll get into the main point there. Every year, Haggadah Shal Pesach come out galore. So this year, one of the Haggadahs that came out was from Rav Chanoich Zundel Bialystok. Now he's famous for writing Pirush Midrashim, Eitz Yosef, Anaf Yosef, on multiple Midrashim. Very prolific writer. What they discovered in manuscript was he collected something called Yalkut Golus V'Yetzias Mitzrayim. So he collected from a vast amount of materials in Midrashim to discuss what is the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and it's appropriate for Leil HaSeder to discuss. So again, there's also this Literature Gaon uses the Sefer HaYashar as his source. So the point is that this was used Keseder. Now, number 2, we spoke about another unique medrash that Lamashal Reb Chaim Kanievsky used, which is found in many Batei Midrashim, is from Menachem Kasher, called Torah Shelemah. So obviously the Torah Shelemah really needs its own series of episodes, but the point is he collected from a vast amount of Midrashim, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky used it. So of course it's cute. In one place you'll find, someone asks Reb Chaim Kanievsky, how could you use the Sefer? Now, why wouldn't Reb Chaim Kanievsky be allowed to use the Sefer? Because what's well known is that the Torah Shelemah, Menachem Kasher, had ties with what we call a Tzioni. So one of the Sefarim, Reb Chaim Kanievsky answers, Madua harav mevi me'Torah Shelemah, hu be'emes lo yeh beseder. I'm only bringing mar mekaymis from him. Well, that's one letter, but Chaim Kanievsky wrote a lot and spoke a lot over many, many years. So a few years ago, they put out a whole volume devoted to Menachem Kasher. And the family got from one of the high-up people in Reb Chaim Kanievsky's Talmidim, who wrote a whole thing how Reb Chaim Kanievsky always loved the Sefer and he used it a lot. So it gives you a different tone of what it was. But the point is, he's using this vast data from such a Sefer. Another, we spoke Parichos, not Parichos, but we spoke Bekitzer about the Eitzer Yisrael, which he was the Eitzer, he put out Eitzer Midrashim, which Reb Chaim Kanievsky uses a ton, and we spoke about Reb Chaim Kanievsky's notes about it. So this, interestingly enough, Reb Menachem Kasher was very wary of the Eitzer Yisrael of Eisenstein and actually wrote an attack on it early on. Now, one other person, which we mentioned already a few times, and we spoke about him last time, is Reb Shlomo Buber. Is he good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, so to speak? And I spoke all about this. So I wanted to just mention is that I came across recently is the Netziv. One of the Midrashim that Buber put out was the Lekach Toiv. Immediately afterwards, the Netziv is already using it Keseder in his Perushim on Chumash Bereshis. Now, what's interesting is it comes out after the Netziv publishes his Chumash Hemikdavar, literally a year later, but he incorporates it already in the Yissachar that were printed by Meir Bar Ilan. So you could now, if you open up a standard, a new Hemikdavar, you wouldn't be able to know this. But if you, but they basically incorporated all the Haggais of Meir Bar Ilan that was on the sides of the Netziv's Chumash. So the point is, he's also using this Reb Shlomo Buber, Sazan Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and we mentioned already many others. Okay, now. Bottom line is, all these Midrashim, including the Sefer HaYashar, especially the Sefer HaYashar story, why is this so important? So at first you'll say, it's not Nagei Halacha. And how could you use these Midrashim? Maybe they're problematic. So the emes is, we know Reb Chaim Kanievsky really goes with this on some level, that there's a concept called Mikabel emes mimisha amrei. Whoever says it, we listen to him. Two letters have come up on auction in recent years after Reb Chaim's material about using Shol Lippman's material. He was asked, could you use it? And he said, yeah, you could. So this is obviously a greater story, which we're not going to go into all that much. We'll mention a drop about it soon, as we'll see how it plays out with names. So the point is, okay, great. You want to know, could you rely on it or not? So it sounds, let's say the Sefer HaYashar, or these things found in the Eitzer Midrashim, or these problematic Midrashim, which we don't know where they are. Okay, but does Reb Chaim ever use it for halacha? Or I guess, and we'll see if this is really called halacha, but does he ever use it for something like that? Now, there's also an issue that we spoke about many times. It's a famous thing. One has to be concerned about forgeries, and things that people say in names of Midrashim that are not. So you have to be very careful. So now, okay. So we'll get back to that. Now, when one learns the time of the Kra and the Mechseyatik, one sees that Reb Chaim has a fascination with names. And I will give many examples in a few minutes. Reb Chaim, not only that, he becomes legendary for an address for all types of questions about names. Is this a good name? Is this a bad name? And multiple questions that come up. So the question is, where did he pull his data from? So it's clear from Lamashal, the time of the Kra, as I'm going to show a bunch of examples, and from various lists that were published from Talmidim of his, with him going over it. It was published based on his knowledge of obviously Tanakh and Midrashim, and including he uses Keseder, the Sefer HaYashar. Now, one Sefer, just to mention, it's quoted as called Shemes Ba'aretz. So this Sefer already came out in more than one edition in his lifetime, and it has Haskamah. It has Haskamah from Rav Yevrav, who wrote other Sefarim with Reb Chaim Kanievsky. He wants to print all the letters that he got from the different about Shemas Anashim and Nashim, what names you should use, and all different types of questions, and he put it together in order, and I'm giving him a bracha about it, basically. But he says, I'm scared to rely on halacha lemaisa. Okay. Now, obviously, he might have said that, but basically, as we've discussed already in the past, a few different episodes about it, lemaisa became halacha, and today also it's considered halacha, the names. Now, halacha doesn't mean it's like a Shulchan Aruch, obviously not, and we'll see where some of these things are coming from, some of the conversations about it right now. Now, Lamashal, also in the Sefer Lemechseyatik, which we spoke about in the last episode, also the point was he's trying to megala times in Chumash or Nach where the name is not open through his usage of these vast midrashim. Now, Everyone knows when one has a child, it could cause lots of stress, lots of problems, shalom bias, not necessarily shalom bias with one's wife. It could cause grandparents get involved or great whatever, and what name and how to say the name. Is it a good name? Is it a bad name? Two names after two people, all different types of questions come up. And Lamashal is also the famous thing of, let's say, Tzavaas HaChassid, which plays out a lot of times, but it plays out also in sometimes in these names also. Now, so like everything else, and I am actually not going to list out all the books about it, but there's multiple volumes written all about names. And it's interesting, when the history of names, we actually spoke about in a different type of context, which was in the Gittin Shiur, and we spoke about there are many Seforim written about names of, because you have to write the correct name for a get. So there's all vast types of literature about that, and we spoke about some of the important ones and where the data that they got from. So that actually plays a role also in understanding names. But we're not going to go fully into all different aspects. Just going to discuss certain aspects in Chaim Kanievsky's literature. Now, one of the Seforim that was published way back, small kuntras, and it's called Kuntras V'Yikrei Shemai B'Yisrael. The author's name was Yosef Oppenheimer, and he gets Haskamas from different people, amongst them Rav Moshe Feinstein. So he says, I see the Kuntras, and he says, Ben Yikriyas Shemos Labanim Levanois, and you show you Kach Gadol, and he says, Be'inyan Zeh Asher Lo Yadua Laharba Inchi Afilu B'Mnei Torah V'Yirah Hashem Yisbarach Asher Ikam B'Zeh Dinim B'Kama Pratim B'Zeh Kavod HaTorah Gadol Asher Leka Davar Shein Boi Masham Lon Rabbi Seinu Chachmei HaTorah B'Gemara U'Midrashim V'Agoynim Shachreim V'Rabbi Seinu Achroinim Eich Liznoi B'Eich L'Kroi Shem L'Vaneinu V'Nei Seinu V'Adam HaYashar Ha'ilechim V'Zbainim Ha'omer Malzeh Chachmei Yisrael Gam V'Zeh Bein Din Bein Eitzam Eila Amukarin V'Yoidin L'Tamid Chacham Yikaim V'Kol D'Rachecha. It's a beautiful Haskamah. This comes out in the 70s. So obviously this is a small little book, beautiful materials, beautiful sources. It's only 44 pages, but of course you can only imagine that as time goes on, the works on names are getting bigger and bigger, especially because of all the data, the databases of Yissachar, Hebrew books, and etc., etc. But this is just one such Sefer, and it's important to see this Haskamah, what Ramosha is bringing out. Now, so we get to Chaim Kanievsky and names. So the first conversation is about, I already said it, so I'll just go through it very briefly. It's Tzavaas HaChassid. So you start learning time to Kra, and early on, in Parshas Bereshis already, he has a few pieces relating to names. So he says over there, the pasuk talks about Achayis Tuval Kayin Naama. She's the daughter of Lemech, okay, and she is the wife of Noach. This is Rashi, and Reb Chaim Kanievsky says the Makar Rashi is the Medrash Rabbah over here. Now, and as I already mentioned in the past, Reb Chaim Kanievsky Kaseder a lot of times will just throw you a bonus. Oh, Rashi, where's the Makar? Is some Medrash. For him, it was nothing. Now, it says like this, comes out, according to this, the shame of the father of Noach and his father-in-law were the same, because they were both Lemech. Now everyone knows the Tzava of Yehudah HaChassid. One of them is that the shame of the Chassid and V'chamav, they can, or the Kala and her Chamasai cannot be the same. So what's going on over here? Now, so obviously we're not talking is that we're not going to go into all the Seforim and the numerous things about Avos Kaim Kol Torah Kula, L'fnei Matan Torah, and then what about Noach and all that. Okay, this is the point. Reb Chaim Kanievsky is just trying to take the Nekuda as a springboard to discuss it, and then what he does is Kedarka B'Kodesh, he brings a bunch. He deals with 3-4 of the passages of Tzavaas HaChassid with names, and he shows problematic Gemaras that are not like this. Okay. Now, Reb Chaim Kanievsky is not the first that was admiring this. Many people were, and there are numerous works on Tzavaas HaChassid, which we're not going to list out. Most notably is Reuven Margolis. He published a work where he collects tons of data on the Tzavaas HaChassid, and he mafalpul bringing tons of marmakaimis about it. But today, the Mashal, one person put out like a 700-800 page work on it a few years back. Now, and we'll get back to Reuven Margolis in 1 second. But here he actually quotes Reuven Margolis by name. So I've quoted some of these things in the past, but I recently came across a full quote about it. It seems that someone asked him, should they quote him when they were putting out this work? And he said, one of the editors, and he said, of course you should. And then he quotes here, one of the closest people to Reb Chaim Kanievsky is Yid Ramosha Shimon Gerlitz. So he says that Reb Chaim Kanievsky met him in the Sifriyat Rambam in Tel Aviv, and he will lend him Sfarim. And he says that the Chazon Ish was very impressed by him, and he said that Reb Reuven himself doesn't know how great he is. This is what he brings down over here. And they made a joke, actually, one of the Sfarim that Reuven Margolis put out was about Malachim, all the data that he collected from everywhere about Malachim. So one of the jokes was, it's Chaval he didn't put out with the pictures of the Malachim also. He collected so much about him. Okay, and it seems the Chazon Ish laughed, or he's about to laugh, or something like that. Bottom line is that Reb Chaim Kanievsky quotes him b'shmai over here, referring to his work on it now. And he brings down the Name Yehudah. The Name Yehudah asks also from various Chazals that the Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid is against various Chazals. We'll get back to Rebbe HaChassid in a moment. Now, this is a fascinating thing because this is, you have to understand what I'm about to say, this is coming from Reb Chaim Kanievsky, B'Shem the Chazon Ish. And this is I would call them more Litvisha approach, but this is what they say. Like Hashemidi, all the Gemaras that I just threw out there, says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, he listed a bunch to have questions on Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid that they're against the often the Gemaras. He says, this is what the Chazon Ish said. Not only that, some of them were a mitzvah, l'mashal to marry Bas HaChaisei, which is against the Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid. However, Rabbi Yehudah HaChassid Zal Tzofa Beruach HaKodesh, he saw with his great Ruach HaKodesh, shemizman veilech kol hazivugim ha'elu lo yatzlichu. They will not be successful. Ve'avagav she'ad zmanim mikol makom ra beruach HaKodesh shemizman veilech lo yatzlichu b'zivugim elu. L'chein hizir aleim shaloi lasos. So Amar Maran, this is Chazon Ish, shekam she'avra al tzava lo yatzlichu. Those that went against the tzava, Rabbi Yehudah HaChassid, were not matzliach. And then he says, powerful things. So here we have, which is very, very fascinating, because normally we don't find such a concept. At least this sounds, if I would tell you a Hasidic Rebbe, a great Hasidic Paisik said such a thing, you'd say, yeah, it makes sense. But that the Chazon Ish said such a thing is to my mind, is mamish not typical. And obviously, as I said, the sugya of Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid is humongous. I'm only going to mention very briefly a few different things. One is that, again, in the Sefer Kuntres Zechronis, which we devoted a whole episode, more than one episode about, with Reb Chaim Kanievsky and oral psakim in the Chazon Ish, he also brings the Chazon Ish was concerned, similar to what he brings here in Time in the Kra. Lamashal, some people ask, what about Sfardim? So they bring down the Stipler said even Sfardim should be Nizar on it. Okay. So quote number one is like this. There's a Reb Shmuel Salant brings down that he heard that Lamaisa, now the Name Yehudah, which we'll get to, says not to be chayshish, and Reb the Gra Amar Ein Lechush Lezeh Vein Lechadish Chumrus V'Yisurim Shloi Nisker B'Talmud Bavli V'Yushalmi. Then he brings down Ben Hagoyin Reb Chaim V'Lozhener Heishiv L'Shoylav B'Zeh Ki Ein Shum Chashash B'Zeh. This is Reb Shmuel Salant coming from a Litvisha based medrash. Okay. Another Maramakim about this is found in one of these works that comes out before World War One. A whole fascinating story, but basically they wanted to take figure out all different minhagim and what people do. So they sent out questionnaires all over Europe, and the idea was to figure out different minhagim, what people are noyig from all different types of Jews. So one of the things they said they wanted to know was, do people observe the Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid to see what it was? Sadly, we don't have the answer. We have all these questions which show it gives us a little bit of a glimpse into what was going on to various minhagim. Okay, now, Lamashal, in 1869, the great Rabbi Yosef Zachariah Stern wrote in the Kvod HaLevana a massive article where he deals with the Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid, showing that it's mamish against dozens of Gemaras. And his HaChra also seems to be not like this Chazon Ish. Okay. Obviously, Tzavaas Rebbe HaChassid in general, very, very sensitive topic, and you have to ask your Rav. Every Rav has different approaches with this. Now, I'm just going to mention about 4 ideas about it, and then we'll move on. Number one is, I've quoted in the past a few times that Reb Chaim Vital, we got a manuscript of Reb Chaim Vital, of a Kabbalah Maisa Sefer of his, and in there he has certain stuff from the Arizal and others, and there he talks about one of the Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid, and it's clear from the passage there that we're not chayshish for the Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid. So here we see a makubal already way back, Reb Chaim Vital, not being chayshish for it. Okay, Lamaisa, the name Yehudah is famous in his tshuva about this tshuva, where he says halavai we should listen to. He says like this: T'mahini al roiv ha'olam shalasis bitamam aretz. They're not makbid, but these things that people mamish go crazy about, and it's yadua. I myself, a lot of times, people always ask me, what do you say about the Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid and this and that? It's something, for some reason, it was tough for some people that they're very, very concerned about it. Rebbe Lezer Fleckless, in a passage, also was fond of quoting over this passage of in a joking manner of what his Rebbe, the Name Yehudah, said. But interestingly enough, just one last marmakam about this is Professor Simcha Emanuel, who has done incredible work with some incredible discovery of a drasha of Pesach of the Reikeach, Tom Savian, which has tons of Hilchos Pesach in this drasha. So over there, basically the research that he shows in that book, he was able to show that the Reikeach was the Talmud Muvak of Rabbi HaChassid. So what's his name? Rabbi Lazar. His Shver was Rabbi Lazar. So already the Talmud Muvak was a nizar in what his Rebbe held. Okay, so some people could say it depends. It wasn't necessarily accepted right away. It could be it was later on. It could be before he's a Talmud, but it sounds like he was a Talmud already earlier. Anyway, the point is a vast amount of literature about it, and this is one right away. You're beginning your time, your Seder in time of the Crow, which I hope you're beginning, or you're already in the middle of. And we have what Chaim Kanievsky says, B'Shem the Chazal Ish, and the Chazal Ish's approach is a very, very strong approach to be very concerned about being makbid on Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid. Okay, we go further in the Sefer, and then we come across another passage. And this passage is, V'yikra es Shlomo Noach, Leimer ze Yinachmeini. So the question is, really his name should be Menachem. Look in Rashi over there. So it brings down Reb Chaim Kanievsky over here in time of HaGra, and there's a Medrash Avkir, which it seems the Yalkut Shmini might have had it, and the Sefer HaYashar, that Noach's real name was Menachem. Just Mr. Shelach told him not to, for whatever reason. He brings down over here. So number one, we have another. So first we see him using a Sefer HaYashar, and here we see that possibly Noach's name was something else. Okay, it was originally something else. Okay, now it's interesting. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, we find that some Tanoim v'Amoraim they are named Menachem, and the only time we have a Menachem in Tanakh that's mentioned is a Rasha, and we're going to see momentarily that to call someone after a Rasha is problematic. But according to this Sefer HaYashar, says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, Menachem was really Noach's name, so you would have what to rely on. So it's a cool shtickle Torah. Again, what's the data? Back to Sefer HaYashar. Now, obviously, the story of the Rasha we're going to discuss in a second, because Reb Chaim Kanievsky has yet another piece, which is, what about calling people after the Nesiim? Okay, they took part in the story with Kairach. So, again, you go further in your Matus, in your Time Nikra, Parshas Kairach, he has a whole discussion, and he says, we find that there are Tanoim Amoram, L'mashal Gamliel, Nesanel, Avidon, Ima Yechas Shalom, Rishaim. We wouldn't find their names in the Gemara. So what does he say? Not all the Nesiim took part in the story of Kairach. Okay, fascinating thing because of this kasha, how far he's willing to go, and obviously you have to look at the Rishonim and the Mefarshim to see if all the Nesiim took part or almost all the Nesiim took part. But this is also because of this question. Now, again, in time of the Kra, now, I mentioned already then that time of the Kra is not only on Chumash, it also goes through Nach. So in the Psukim and Mishlei of Shem Risham Yarkiv, so over there, the Chaim has a massive arichos about a Rasha, calling someone after the name of a Rasha. And he says, it's Bavos, the State in Gemara, based on the Psukim in Mishlei, Shem Risham Yarkiv. So you should not call Lo Yikradum Ludnoi Shem Adam Rasha. So first, Reb Chaim asking us a question. We don't find the Pais can bring this down. So it's cute over here. He says, we don't even find that the Magen Avraham and Simon Kuf Nun Vav brings this down. What does it mean? Because it's Kiyadua and Simon Kuf Nun Vav, the Magen Avraham brings down a bunch of different anhagas from all different places. People, I think there's even one Sefer written about it, but its own story, what's going on in the Magen Avraham and Simon Kuf Nun Vav. He brings from a vast different, all different types of anhagas. And he doesn't bring it down over there. We say, Reb Chaim is like, where should someone bring it down? That Magen Avraham and Simon Kuf Nun Vav. And even he doesn't. He says, yeah, there's a Marsha that says, based on the Gemara, Rasha. So he says, Vais the Chais, that everyone held, it's only a Midas Chasidus, it's not a Eser Mamish. And why is that so? So Reb Chaim Kanievsky over here has a whole arichos about this. And he throws out a bunch of fascinating things. It seems he had a whole conversation about this, letters back and forth with Rav Schlesinger, and they're published here. The letters are published here. Now, one of the names that is the discussion is about Yehudis. Is it a good name for a Jewish girl to have such a name? So he said. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky answers, "What do you mean? State the Ramah, the Ma'is of Hanukkah. Yehudis is involved, but it seems in the Psukim she's the shame of the wife of Esav." And he goes through Kedarka the Kodesh with a vast amount of Bakiyas of different names of Rishaim and L'chayra, what's Pshat, and how could this be? And he deals with it. So he says, one of the things he says, this Rosh Schlesinger reminded him about a Chidah that he had forgotten about, that he says, yeah, thanks for returning my Aveda, I forgot about it. And bottom line is, Reb Chaim comes to the following conclusion: "B'dareinu chalila lismei chalzeh likreis b'shem Rishon. Afilu m'zeh shem yafe. De'inenu roish. Akol Rishonim niskasha gamal tanoim v'amaram. Eich kor b'shem eselu v'af echad lo tirtzu tirzeh." Okay, B'kitzer, he's very against it. Now, so what's the name of a Rasha? So then they start asking Reb Chaim Kanievsky all different names, and there's a whole section in one of the Seforim, Shemus Ba'aretz, and other Seforim of the names of Rishon. They would say this name, and Reb Chaim would say, look in this pasuk, it's a Rasha. This, or look in a Sefer HaYashar, for example, once again. So the point is, yet another question that keeps on coming up. So Reb Chaim Kanievsky throws you to using the Sefer HaYashar. Now, part of this conversation I mentioned earlier, which relates to using these midrashim from questionable people. And then B'kabel emes misha amroi, also another concept. So this has been a debate throughout centuries. Mirza Hashem one day will give a long shir about this, but which is follows: if we find sometimes Gedolim quote something from a problem, what we would call a problematic source, from a person that's not necessarily kosher v'yosher. So sometimes you could say very simple: the Gadol didn't know, but many times it's clear the Gadol did know. So how does he do it? So what's interesting is, and Professor Spiegel, in one of his farm of Amudim Tol Sefer Ivri, B'Shari Tfus, deals with it coming out from the sugya of these psukim and mishlei, quoting, bringing a whole arichos about it, is if you could quote Rishayim or name after Rishayim. So it's Mamish has a played out in how quoting certain sources, and the various people talk about it. Now, just to mention one time this happened many times with the Stei Chemed. One time, in the first volume of the Stei Chemed, published in 1891, he quotes, he's discussing a certain thing, and he brings a whole long letter from Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern. Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern, in that letter, quotes in his long list of Marmakaimis, Moses Mendelssohn in Vayikra. Okay? Fast forward, the Marsham gets a hold of the Stei Chemed, writes a letter to him a few years later, says, how could you quote Moses Mendelssohn? So Stei Chemed doesn't even know what to do. Now, the truth is the Stei Chemed had no idea who Moses Mendelssohn most likely was. He's a Sephardi. So he writes to Rabbi Zechariah, look what happened. You got me in trouble over here. The Marshamas are going after me. How could I do it? So Rabbi Yissachar Stern Kedarka B'Kodesh writes a massive tshuva, which is different. There's a few different versions of this tshuva. The point is dealing with, if you could quote Mendelssohn, and he says, I meant Vayikra. Vayikra is Naftali Wiesel. Naftali Wiesel is not problematic. And anyway, you're allowed to quote from sources that are not problematic because, and then he goes with the whole arichos, which a lot of people deal with, is there's a difference if you're hearing a shir from a Rasha or apikairis, or you're reading something from an apikairis. Assuming Mendelssohn is even apikairis, you go Naftali, the Rabbi Zechariah is going, even in worst case scenario, the way the Galicianer Gedolim felt. But this is obviously a massive conversation about the different approaches of Mendelssohn, quoting Mendelssohn, Naftali Wiesel, Rabbi Zechariah Stern. His shita now, just to be clear, Rabbi Zechariah Stern was not a person pro-maskilim. As a matter of fact, we devoted a whole episode to show the maskilim attacking him. And in an unpublished paper, Professor Yehudah Galinsky documents that he was very anti maskilim. He read all their stuff, and he did fight it out in numerous newspaper issues. A different time, I think I might have mentioned, with Moshe Lillenbein, he was attacking. This was a Rasha, evil maskilim. Evil is to put it mildly, attacking Shulchan Aruch, but for Hesia and dozens of newspaper articles. And who was one of the people that fought it? Was Rabbi Yissachar Stern. So just if he quoted it, he knew what he was doing, and it's an approach that until today, literally a few weeks ago, without getting into it, this has come up again in a battle between two Haredi, I guess for lack of for this thing, historians. This has played out. Just to throw out their names, Rabbi Shua Munshine and Rabbi David Kamenetsky have had it out about this, and recently some materials about this topic has come to light from Rav Munshine, even though it's 10 years after he died, 11 years after he died. Now, going further on, okay, names. So, is anything else with names in the Sefer? Yes, there's plenty more. And these two pieces are, these are like legendary pieces in Reb Chaim Kanievsky. Whenever you want to just like show someone Reb Chaim Kanievsky's knowledge, okay, so he knows Kol Torah Kula, Gemara, Chazal, big deal. What else does he know? So, I'm very fascinated by these two pieces, and that is as follows. There's a Chuvas Mabit that talks about if one can name someone, when you learn Chumash, especially in Maver Sedra, so we know there's names are all over in the Chumash. So before you get to Lechacha, there's dozens of names mentioned. So let's say someone finds a name there that they like. Could they use it? They don't even know anything about that person necessarily. They didn't learn the Sefer HaYashar, the Midrashim. They come and they write to Chaim, could I use it? Okay. So the Mabit actually has a tshuva where he comes to the conclusion you should not use names from before Avraham Avinu. So the Pesach Tshuva and other Achronim, they handle this Chuvas Mabit, and there's a lot written about it. So they asked Reb Chaim Kanievsky about it. I'm positive Reb Chaim Kanievsky just always kept this in the back of his head, and he collected data about it to have fun. Reb Chaim Kanievsky says like this: let's go through 33 different names found before Avraham Avinu, and I'm going to give you my Mekaymis to show that it was used. Now, the difference over here is, normally, what does Reb Chaim Kanievsky do this? He shows you his vast knowledge of, I said, Midrashim. So no, here, let's say Adam. So he brings you, say, the Dairis, a Kiryat Sefer of the Miri, Oitzer G'daylim. And then he says, Shema G'daylim. And then he says, look in the Haskamah of the Sefer Magen Yibayim HaMasechtes Hayris. You'll see the same Adam, Sefer Adam is used. Look in the Encyclopedia Pachad Yitzchak. Now, this is printed, just to be clear, before search engines. He asks Hevel, look in the Chuvas Ramah. Okay, and then Bekitzer, he goes through various names, showing again his knowledge in Achronim, Geoinim, Diktukei Seifrim, Masas Rabin Yamin, Seder Hadairis. Some of the things, okay, he does show that the Gemara that they used these names. In one place, he talks about, if you look in the Sefer Miles Hatzdaka, the Haskamah over there, you'll see this name is being used. But Kitzer, bottom line is, over here, you get to see Reb Chaim Kanievsky in his glory, with names of, to answer this question, showing 33 cases with vast materials about it. Okay, now then there's another one. This is also very famous. This one, I'm positive Reb Chaim Kanievsky just had fun. He probably started this out when he was very young. And that is as follows. In Parshas Kiseitze, everyone knows, one of the psukim is lo yilvash gever simos isha and vice versa. So the question asked is, could you call a zachar and a woman with a woman's name or vice versa? Okay. Says the Divrei Malkiel, ein lasses kain, v'yesh was a kama chishashos, not iser gomer, and he says v'zeich l'davar lo yilvash gever simos isha. And he brings down a Pesamar Makam for it, which is interesting that he brings it down, but not for now. Says Reb Chaim Kanievsky, what do I think about this topic? And he brings you 79 pieces of material through his vast Bekias showing names of men that were given women's names and vice versa. Mind-boggling. From Midrashim and the like. Yeah, he quotes him Margalah Sayam also, and different names. One a more famous name is Simcha, for example. Tamar, it seems also there's certain Makairis. Okay. So they bring down that Reb Chaim Kanievsky, this, I guess, one of the early times that this Kuntrus was published. So Reb Shach saw it. Reb Shach said, Lemaisa, Lo Yilbash Kever is telling the Tkufa. So maybe Meshach HaDayris, they were more Mako with it, but today it sounds like you should be more Machmir, as Reb Shach gesagt. Okay. It's unclear if Lemaisa, Reb Chaim Kanievsky accepted this psak, or he kept on. I think he did allow names of women because of all this vast arichos of his. It sounds like from the various books on names that have all his psakim. But just to give two other marmakaimis about it, besides Reb Chaim Kanievsky, these are marmakaimis that he does not bring. So as I quoted numerous times, one of my great heroes is the Adaris. So the Adaris wrote a fascinating autobiography called Seder Elio. So over there he talks about the name of one of his children. He says as follows. He says that I named this child Yosef Ruvain. Yosef was after Yosef Reisen, the author of the Edis Yosef and Paris Yosef, who was someone I liked a lot, and I got to know him when he was in Tells. And then he says Ruvain. Why? What's the name Ruvain? Al Shem Achoisi Harabanit Rivka. Fascinating that he's naming his son after his sister Rivka. Now, interestingly enough, this Rivka was very learned. That's a different story. We'll get into a different time. But just once we're talking about Adaris, in his autobiography, we also see in Litta, it seems certain people were concerned with Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid, in a whole story with the Piskei Tshuva, that he records over here, a meeting of his, and then he gives you some more data about it in an article of his published in Yagdal Torah, under a pen name of his called Tzar V'Rav, that it came out that it sounds like the Piskei Tshuva was concerned about Tzavaas Rabbi HaChassid, and he was not necessarily, or his father was not necessarily. But bottom line is, from this Reb Chaim Kanievsky and this Adaris, it sounds like they were not so concerned, that it's not a problem of Lois Hilbash. Okay. There's another Tshuva Sefer from another great, unbelievable Baki, Rev Leiter. So Rav Leiter, Rav Zev Wolf Leiter has a Tshuva Sefer Tzil and Nefesh Chaya. He also has a Tshuva Siman Kuf Chaf Zayin, where he also shows cases of women that had men names. So it's clear that it's not it would sound like that throughout the generations they were very makel about it. Just to throw out there, once we're talking about names, so Reb Chaim Kanievsky, something that he's very fond of, I claimed way back that this has to do with his fascination with the Minchas Chinuch, maybe influenced him. What about an androgynous? What name do you give an androgynous? Does he get a male name, a female name? And he has a ganze shtickle about it over here, found in the time of the Kra in Parshas Ki Seitze. Now, another name, which is always famous, and then the people in shuls, probably in more recent years, people are much more into it. Yissachar, how do you say it? Yissachar, if you pronounce both sins, all these different things, a lot of different materials about it. So he brings down a HaGra of the Chazon Ish about that, also in this Sefer, time in the Kra. Now, there are multiple other issues of names, which I will mention some of them briefly, but one thing that I found very fascinating was he's asked about these names Keseder. I'm sure that in this they're working on the set of the Tshuvas of his in all different years. It's going to come out like a massive, like thousands of pages of all the names he was asked, not only just like these small little Seforim that have come out up till now. But what's interesting is like this. he says, where does he have this koyach? He's asked all these questions about names. So where does he, how does he answer it? So we say, how does it, so I'm telling you is that in a lot of these cases, it's through his vast knowledge in all these midrashim. But he says, in one of the people asked him, he says like this, Kefi mashenoistem befi min hashamayim ani oine. I answer. He says he's giving a tremendous insight that there was some type of, he felt that there was some type of thing from upstairs, a direct, call it like a urim tumim type of thing, and that's what you see Klal Yisrael accepted. And in one of the versions of the Sefer, they even write on like a fancy in the cover, they indent. Shemus Ba'aretz, Kefi mashenoistem befi min hashamayim ani oine. Now, Agav, they write to page Kuf Chav Beis, and it's not true, it's in Kuf Chav Hey, because there was updates. But anyway, fine, that's a typo. Now, one other discussion of names I'll mention in this episode, and the rest we'll keep for the last episode on the Sefer on Chumash, is as follows. Naming a child after his father. Now, it's interesting is that there's a lot about this. Also, it seems Sfardim, they're known to name after fathers or people that are alive at least. So Chaim can ask in a different Sefer of his that we spoke all the way back about, which is the Sefer on the Rambam, Sagdama. So he wrote this incredible Sefer way back in his early years, Shara Melech. So over there, he has a whole piece about Bar Kappara. Bar Kappara was from the Bezdin of Rebbe. Says that's what the Rambam says. Over here, the Chaim has a whole field day about Bar Kappara, all different pieces of information, again from a crazy amount of Yehudah and Chazal. And one of the points is, it sounds like really he was named after the same name of his father. So then Chaim brings some other passable Tanoim Aram that they were also named after their father, and he says, all of them kol hani nifter aviim lefnei shenoldu l'kein karlem al shem aviim. Okay, and he says also we find certain rishonim that they were called after their names of the father, Rabbi Yitzchak, and he brings you some makaros about that. Okay, anyway, so you see also way back in that sefer about names, and that's the conclusion for today. These are some of the aspects of names. Mirz Hashem. In the next episode, we'll just discuss very, very briefly some other aspects of names, and we'll conclude with what's the story with the time of the Kra and some other aspects.
Thank you, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. What a great episode to close out the secular year of 2025. That's when it was recorded, or probably uploaded, either today or the next day or two, as soon as Rabbi Brut gets it okay and the green light to get it out. Looking forward. Thank you.